Welcome to Washington Unplugged. I'm John Dickerson. The debate in Washington over what to do next in Afghanistan has spilled out into the open. President Obama yesterday told Bob Schieffer on Face the Nation that he is reassessing how to go forward. Some in the Pentagon want to hurry him along. Perhaps as a move in that direction, in today's Washington Post are excerpts of a 66-page leaked report from General Stanley McChrystal, the top U.S. and NATO commander in Afghanistan. In the report, McChrystal says that he will need more forces in Afghanistan next year and that without them, the conflict will likely result in failure. Joining me to discuss is the Washington Post national editor, Rajiv Chandrasekaran, who obtained a portion of McChrystal's report. Rajiv, to start, I want to play you something that Obama said yesterday on Face the Nation and get your reaction to it.
Sure.
Whatever decisions I make are going to be based first on a strategy to keep us safe, then we'll figure out how to resource it. We're not going to put the cart before the horse and just think by sending more troops, we're automatically going to make Americans safe.
Rajiv, I thought we already had a strategy in Afghanistan. That's the reason McChrystal was there.
And so did General McChrystal. When he went out there in late June, he was asked to do this assessment by Defense Secretary Bob Gates, and he was operating under the presumption that there was and still is a U.S. government-wide strategy, and that was a strategy that was announced in March after a high-level policy review conducted by senior members of the Obama administration that said a couple of things. It said at the most sort of basic level that the principal goal is to defeat, dismantle, and destroy al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and Pakistan. But then it goes on to say in the very first bullet point of the strategy that the way to do that is through a comprehensive civilian military integrated counterinsurgency campaign. And that's what General McChrystal has drawn up. He's gone out there. He spent 60 days on the ground looking at the situation, concluded that the situation was serious, was dire, but sees a path ahead that involves some very fundamental changes in the way the international forces operate there. But what he calls for is a comprehensive counterinsurgency campaign, which is what he assumed he was being asked to do by the White House.
So what's changed?
Well, what's changed are a number of things, John. Since General McChrystal got out there have been Afghan elections in which there's been just widespread fraud, as everybody has reported, a lot of it in the support of the incumbent Hamid Karzai. And it looks like he'll certainly win another term, but he will be governing certainly under a cloud of suspicion, of illegitimacy, perhaps in the eyes of many Afghans, which would very much complicate U.S. and international efforts to promote good governance there. There have been other factors as well back here in Washington. Leading Democrats on Capitol Hill have expressed growing skepticism of sending additional forces there. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Senator Carl Levin, the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, among them, in recent days have really questioned the wisdom of additional forces there. And public opinion polling has showed a softening among the American public in the support for the war effort, as well as the fact that the Obama administration had hoped that health care would have been wrapped up by now. And European allies have also expressed some increasing squeamishness. In Italy, where 6 Italian soldiers were killed last week, there are new calls for withdrawal, as well as in Germany, which is going to be having presidential elections soon. So taken all together, the landscape here has fundamentally changed. And so the folks in the White House say, well, yes, that was our strategy back then, but taking into account all of these things, we need a fundamental time for reassessment here as to whether this broad counterinsurgency strategy really makes the most sense or whether the U.S. government should contemplate other approaches.
But it's still in the U.S. national interest to not have al-Qaeda have a foothold in Afghanistan, whether it's there now or whether it could leak over into Afghanistan if the country goes further into chaos and turmoil, isn't it?
Indeed. And nobody disputes that nobody wants al-Qaeda to once again set up bases of operation in Afghanistan. Obviously, now many senior al-Qaeda leaders are believed to actually be across the border in the mountainous frontier provinces of Pakistan. But the real debate is, how do you prevent those al-Qaeda operatives from once again setting up safe havens in Afghanistan? General McChrystal and a number of other people argue that the best way to do this is through this comprehensive counterinsurgency campaign that involves promoting security, protecting the Afghan people, building up the Afghan security forces, promoting good governance. But there are others in the U.S. government and on Capitol Hill, and even some in the military, who question whether a narrower approach is what makes sense in Afghanistan. They argue that Afghanistan is a fundamentally decentralized nation where tribal rivalries are hardened, where trying to set up a strong national government with a professional security force really is a task that's perhaps way too unattainable. And instead, the U.S. should narrow its mission and focus more on counterterrorism, essentially going after and killing the bad guys who might come back there using Predator drones, using special forces units on the ground, but not this massive counterinsurgency effort that's envisaged by General McChrystal.
Right.
Now,
of course, the Predator drones are what got us into trouble with the Afghans and others in the Middle East, because they tend to be inaccurate sometimes and kill civilians. Let me ask you one question, though, about this dance we're in now. McChrystal sent this report. It didn't name a specific number of troops, and so the president is able to tell Bob Schieffer that he hasn't received the request for troops. But when you read the report, wasn't it a request for troops?
Oh, most certainly. I mean, he's laying out his case here for additional troops. The question is how many, and to some degree, it matters less whether it's 10,000 or 20,000 or 30,000. All numbers that are sort of, I think, in the range of possibility. But is it the sort of question of one additional troop more? And that's really what the White House is going to have to decide. And I think once they get over that hurdle, which is really a question that's posed by this assessment, then the follow-on issue of the troop request becomes perhaps something of a easier decision to make.
Is it possible, or what's your guess about the reaction if the president decided after his very thorough review that they say that he's going through right now, the president essentially denies the troop request from the commander he installed in Afghanistan to follow this new strategy just 6 months after he's installed that commander? What do you think the reaction will be to a decision like that?
Well, I think that there'll be people on the Democratic left who will be broadly supportive of that. And he might be shoring up elements of his base that way. But he will come under a welter of criticism from congressional Republicans who will argue that he's essentially flip-flopped on Afghanistan when during the campaign he noted that this was the good war, the war that needed to be fought, in contrast to Iraq, where he promised to send more troops. And indeed, he did send more troops this spring. But he likely will come under a real barrage of criticism from Republicans saying that McChrystal has outlined a path forward. They will argue that McChrystal's plan broadly makes sense and needs to be resourced. And so either way here, he's going to find himself in a very sort of politically volatile position.
Okay. Rajiv, thanks very much. Great reporting today in the Washington Post.
Good to talk to you, John.
Afghanistan is just one of the tough decisions the president faces this month. He still is battling to pass health care reform, and this week he takes the international stage at the United Nations and as host of the G20. He talked about all of this on the Sunday shows yesterday. Here to help me sort through it is Marc Ambinder, CBS News chief political consultant. Marc, what did you take away from the roadblock coverage of the president yesterday?
Well, it suggests that the president's bandwidth is at capacity. He's dealing with Afghanistan, he's dealing with healthcare, he's dealing with climate change, he's dealing with the political situation of the New York governor, he's dealing with nonproliferation, all within the concentrated period of 4 days, and he's trying to communicate discrete messages about each. And he's having trouble because the media initially was focused on race, whether race was driving some of the opposition to healthcare, and now the media is focused on whether there is essentially open warfare between the civilian national security establishment, headed by the commander-in-chief, and a bunch of generals at the Pentagon.
Let me ask you on that. We'll start on that, and then we'll go to healthcare. In terms of the politics of this, he is asking a lot of the left in terms of healthcare because it appears the public option is going away. If he were to ask for more troops in Afghanistan, can the left bear that?
It's not clear. Certainly, there is a lot of skepticism among the organized left now about Afghanistan, but there's not nearly as much of it as there is about when it comes to the public option on healthcare. I mean, they're willing essentially to give him not a pass, but they're willing, I think, to give him some time. And I don't perceive that the volume of anxiety, which is a mixed metaphor, but you understand what I'm trying to say. The degree of anxiety is that large. I think that as the months go by, as troops from Iraq are repurposed to Afghanistan, or if McChrystal comes out and says explicitly on television, I need more troops, then the debate might polarize and Obama's going to have to make that choice. I think he thinks that he has a couple of months before he really has to make a decision. And I think what yesterday was about, his answers on Afghanistan, was essentially saying, I'm the commander-in-chief, I want to take time to study my options, and so everyone needs to simmer down.
You know, that's right. Although we see in the Washington Post today the piece we were just talking about. I mean, you recognize this for what it is, which is if it's a leaked document and people are now making this case in public.
Right.
If the president thinks he has a couple of months, it's also going to be a couple of months where he's going to have to face these kinds of eruptions in the papers
Right.
Every now and again, and that's got to be politically weakening.
It's really tough. The American people in aggregate are very concerned about Afghanistan. They don't know what the strategy is. They don't think the war is going well. But it's not that issue hasn't reached a point where it is driving their perceptions toward President Obama. But if it seems as if the generals want more troops and President Obama says no, that's the type of issue, again, that could reflect on President Obama directly and could curtail his ability to make a decision in the time frame that he wants. So there's no question that this is more risky than it was for the White House last week.
Healthcare. Let's switch to that. The Senate Finance Committee released their bill. They're going to go into markup tomorrow, which will be a long process. What's the game plan for the White House now going forward, now that they actually have 5 pieces of legislation in the 2 houses of Congress?
I think the game plan is still to focus on 1 or 2 Republican senators, Senator Olympia Snowe actually, who released a set of amendments today, many of which the White House will like and could be incorporated into this bill. And these amendments, if they're incorporated into the bill, probably would lead to Senator Snowe supporting the bill, which would be a huge victory for the White House. I think they're still going to have to negotiate this tricky public option balance because there still remains, particularly in the House, an absolute determination to have a public option in the final bill. But one thing I think was significant about yesterday is that the tenor of the debate really does seem to have shifted. The president was able to portray himself as a conciliator who is now pulling together all of the strings. No longer are we debating whether health care is necessary or not. It seems now that it's a given that it's necessary and that we're headed towards a bill and the president can step back and sort of play the role of orchestrator and let the symphony in Congress do their work. And I think that showed itself yesterday. So I think you'll continue to see him do that.
And do you, one of the analogies being mentioned both in the press but also on the Hill is that basically we're going to watch this go forward like with the stimulus package. There will be the public play and then he will be pulling those levers, and at the end it will be Chief of Staff Rahm Emanuel in Nancy Pelosi's office dealing, buying votes and putting this together at the very last minute. Does that sound right to you?
That sounds probably. I mean, look, it's an infinitely complex piece of legislation, probably the biggest piece of social policy legislation since, you could say, Medicare Part D or No Child Left Behind in the Bush administration. And that's usually the process by which these things get finished. I think what you'll see differently, though, is that the White House will try and communicate a little bit differently. They will try to let less of the sausage making make it out in public, because whenever the public is consumed by the sausage making, the president doesn't look good, and his approval numbers go down.
And isn't that in part what the 5 shows yesterday and Letterman this evening is
Right.
about? Is even if he's not making the sale, as we've seen
Right.
in polls, the sale is not being made, but at least it's something else to show other than hours of Max Baucus.
And what it says is, I'm in control here. I'm managing this process. We're moving along. It's going to work. It's an attempt to reassure the American people broadly, but independent voters in particular, that the president is on a glide path to getting this done in a responsible way.
The president also addressed on all of the shows the anger, the questions of race, and he said essentially it's not about race and it's about the press. He mentioned to Bob Schieffer on Face the Nation. He said it's basically catnip for cable, which is true.
But it's sort of beside the. But it's true and.
Right. So what's your take on?
Well, there are certainly people who are close to Obama who do believe that race is motivating it to some degree. Obama, it's not in Obama's interest to make even if he were inclined to would agree with that supposition, it's not in his interest necessarily to admit that. But I think in general, what he's more concerned about is the polarization, and he's concerned about independence. I really don't think he cares that 45% of the electorate now seems to be resolutely opposed to him. And I do think he thinks that Democrats are using the race issue as a way of, as a way of inflaming the debate in a way that is not helpful to the president. So I think, I think his answer was fairly truthful. I mean, race, I'm sure, motivates some people, but I think that from Obama's perspective, the more people say that race motivates some people, the worse he is, because as a president, he still has to walk a very thin line. And there are people in this country who might not have palpable concerns about his race, but who have anxieties that stem from a lot of things about Barack Obama that he needs to manage, and stuff like this just isn't helpful.
Right, and those independents who may have those legitimate anxieties tend to get undone when their legitimate anxieties are labeled as
right,
racism.
And that's right, and clearly, as he acknowledges, people have there's significant debate in this country about the size of government.
Now we also have a little bit of a shift for the president. He's still speaking about the economy today in New York, but then he's going to go on the world stage. He'll be at the UN and then at the G20. Is that a distraction from his domestic, or there's sometimes when the president shows up on the world stage, he can remind a lot of people that they voted for him because they liked the fact he was going to improve America's image overseas. What's your take?
I think that's correct. On climate change and on nonproliferation are two issues where he can marshal his rhetoric to good use and to good effect, particularly among, again, independent voters in this country who chose him because of the type of government that that he would bring to bear, the type of policies that he would, not the type of policies, but the style in which he would go about doing that, and that includes restoring America's credibility in the world. I think what he has to do, though, is avoid these grip and grin meetings with dictators and enemies of America. If he runs into Chavez again, you probably won't see him smile as broadly as he did. But in general, when he is engaged on the international stage, it tends to help his standing back home.
Okay, Marc Ambinder, CBS News chief political consultant. Thanks very much. Thanks for watching Washington Unplugged. Join us every weekday at 12:30 on CBSNews.com. I'm John Dickerson.